This episode is dedicated to the memory of the man who ultimately started me down the path of becoming a scientist. My undergraduate advisor, Leon Neuenschwander, who I mentioned in our last episode, was a PhD student of Henry Wright, who was to become my master's and PhD advisor or major professor. And that all started when, in October of 1982, as I was about to graduate. I was going to graduate in December of 1982, and I'm walking down the hallway of the forestry building, now called the Natural Resources Building at the University of Idaho, and I see an advertisement for a graduate assistantship at a university, and I thought, and this is how much time I put into all of my thinking back in those days. I thought, well, maybe since I don't have any other options in mind, maybe I can be a graduate student. And I took that note off the bulletin board. This is before we had these electronic devices that allowed us to communicate in much different manner. So I took that off the bulletin board, took it into my advisor, my undergraduate advisor, Leon Neuenschwander, and said, I've been thinking about maybe going to graduate school. And at this point, I'd been thinking about it for all of 2 or 3 minutes. And Professor Neuenschwander said, okay. But he looked at the piece of paper and he says, you don't want to go there. Let me make a phone call. And he called Henry Wright on the phone right then and there. And as soon as he got him connected, he introduced me and I talked to Henry Wright. And Henry asked if I was interested in getting a master's degree and a PhD. And he asked if I wanted to do both back to back. And I was so ecstatic at the time because bear in mind, 10 minutes ago, I didn't have the slightest idea what I was going to be doing. And now the leading fire scientist in the world was asking me if I wanted to do a master's and a PhD. As it turns out, he did that because he wanted to curate people. And then once they were adept at running the prescribed fire program, that was a fundamental part of his research and teaching, Henry Wright's research and teaching. He didn't want that person just staying for a couple of years. He wanted them there for long enough to make it worthwhile. So I committed to doing a master's and PhD with Henry Wright on the phone in October of 1982, and then started in January of 1983, right after I graduated. It was Leon Neuenschwander who set up the opportunity for me to pursue that path. And it was Leon who recognized that I was intelligent enough and hardworking enough to pursue and succeed in a graduate program. So to Leon Neuenschwander, who a professor, my undergraduate advisor, living off grid after having a conversation with me about doing that at a professional meeting we both attended in Tucson. With that, we're going to turn to part four, probably part four of four in the Carbon Pulse, or Living on Ancient Liquid Sunshine. So with that, Neil, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again for joining me today.
That was a really nice dedication and story, Guy, and what a mentor to have in your corner in embarking down the necessarily rocky road, of conservation biology or academia or science generally.
Yes, these were two very decent, amazing human beings, Henry Wright and Leon Neuenschwander.
And you mentioned that Leon Neuenschwander was living off grid in his last years. Did he make that decision constitutively, or did he just happen to own a property that was off grid? And as some people have, some families have had access to a rustic cabin in New England or wherever.
No, he built the whole thing. He bought the property and he built it up from nothing. And He started doing that after we connected at a professional meeting that was held in Tucson, Arizona. I was already living off grid, and so we had a conversation. And one of the things he was said is that he was very concerned about hyperinflation driving the economy into the toilet, essentially. And so it was shortly after that that he began creating this off-grid homestead for him and his wife.
Wow. So for similar reasons to yourself, he
Yes,
chose that.
yes, very similar reasons. And I suspect, like me, if he knew then what I know now, he might not have done that because once you understand the aerosol masking effect, once you understand that nuclear power plants melting down are going to strip away stratospheric ozone, superheat the planet, then it seems like taking a leadership role in getting people to live simply, to live differently, doesn't seem like such a swift idea after all. But
Well, we're going to talk about all of those things in the future and the idea of living off grid and what that can mean for people. And we're going to talk about nuclear. These are all going to become focused topics once we finish with getting us to the present. Just the skipping the stones, really. Again, another bad rock metaphor, off the geologic and human history of fossil fuels and how we got into this mess. Um, and with that, let us turn to our first slide. We ended last time having gotten to about 1918 with the story of how oil rose from just a home lighting solution to become the fuel of the industrial society alongside coal initially, um, but oil and then oil and gas become the fuels of modern industrial society, really starting after decisively after World War One, and after that inexorably and through World War Two, accelerating massively during and after World War Two. But I want to start with something close to home. This is in the upper left. If you were in the what is today now the Tony and rather expensive and reasonably pretty beach town of Long Beach, California, it's also a port town still, a working port. But this is just, I think, in the area of Long Beach, California, in the upper left. That is what it looked like in the 1920s. In fact, much of the California coast was covered in oil derricks, much of LA. If you were in Los Angeles, not just Long Beach, which is a little bit south and east of Los Angeles proper, but now just a suburb of it. It was a separate town. It was rural. There were fields and hills and dunes, but then there were these black oil covered derricks. And in the lower right is another image of California wildcatters when the California oil rush started with a gusher behind them. You can see the oil just shooting out. That oil is not being captured for any use, it's just shooting out. And the oilmen are covered with oil because they've been wrangling with this gusher. And that's what this industry was like. And that's what California coast was like. Um, so we will do anything. We did do anything to the land to get this stuff.
and to our own bodies, these men are draped in oil.
Mm, indeed. And, you know, today we whine if we find that whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president, some of us whine when we discover that they have authorized, as they have every administration, new oil exploration and gas exploration. Now, not with such ugly things, but fracking doesn't create towers like this, because fracking is not about the oil ever gushing. Fracking is about having to pump shit and explode shit underground to hopefully be able to then pump up or extract some kind of oil or gas. So fracking is a little lower to the ground. It rarely creates these kind of giant towers, and it can happen without. It's more high tech. It's some only slightly less messy. The mess is hidden. a little more. But we whine at the thought that offshore oil exploration might be expanded, but it's always expanding somewhere. And it just isn't expanding now into the high priced real estate of Long Beach, California. It's already been there and done that.
And take a look at that car in the upper left panel, lower right corner of the upper left panel.
Indeed.
Yeah, they don't make them like that anymore.
No. Let's go to the next slide. This is a nodding donkey, as it's called, or a pump jack. They've looked remarkably similar since the very first oil drilling operation. It oscillates, and it's at its head on the right there is the pump, the thing that goes up and down, and with every stroke it pulls a certain amount of oil out of a resource or a well. This one is decorated like a bird. So nice that they're doing this, and this is actually in the United Arab Emirates. Let's go to the next. And this is a bird. It's decorated like a bird that is a rare bird that is increasingly threatened. That is a desert bird out there. So it's so nice that we're decorating our oil pump jacks like the disappearing species. And so people wonder, it's worthwhile understanding that when a barrel of crude oil comes out of the ground, all crude oil is different in different parts of the world. And when you refine it, what you're doing is you're heating it, and it goes into a tower. That's why refineries have all these tall chimneys and structures on them. It literally is a giant still, like you're making whiskey, only much more sophisticated, much more explosive and dangerous also. You are heating the crude oil up, where it completely liquefies or gasifies into different fractions, and it literally rises because of the heat. You've added a bunch of heat to it, and at each level, the heavier, it's really obvious here, the heavier fuels start at the bottom. The heavier things that are separated out include lubricating oil. You can just put your cursor down there. Paraffin wax, asphalt. Those are the heaviest things. They remain, they solidify quickly at room temperature. Wax does and asphalt does. Lubricating oils are a little thicker and less flammable. And then fuel oil, which is another word for diesel, I believe. Fuel oil is bunker oil, which is used in shipping. It's a very thick oil. And then diesel oil, which is lighter, kerosene, lighter still, and then petrol. I think kerosene is used or refined further for aviation fuel, and gasoline in the British world, they call it petrol. In the Italian and Spanish world, they call it benzina. Is a lighter fuel. And then there are even other products that come out as gases, which are kept, like propane and other gases are liquefied, and you use them you might get your propane tank filled to use on your home grill. But this is how the many different products come out of a barrel of oil.
And there's a lot. We've come up with technology to separate these different kinds of fuels and turn them into artifacts that are important in maintaining this set of living arrangements.
And we saw that the first product to be extracted, the first reason that crude oil was extracted with great labor and risk, was just to get kerosene for lamps and lighting. So just that kerosene product there at 200 degrees Celsius was all that was used, and everything else that came off was discarded, except for maybe paraffin waxes and asphalt in the early stages. But many of these other things were simply discarded into the atmosphere before the automobile. Now, right from the start in the automobile, I'm now speaking of using gasoline in the automobile, in the internal combustion engine. Just our use of gasoline was not straightforward. The first, as I understand it, the first engines and fuels, the first fuels for car engines had an octane of only 40. Octane is just one of many parts or fractions of gasoline, and it allows for much more uniform and complete combustion. And so, right from the start, the early vehicles had a problem with knocking, which isn't just an aesthetic irritation. It's not just something that bothers you while you drive your car. It means that the combustion is not happening in a uniform way. It's uneven, it's incomplete, it's inefficient, and it's actually happening in 2 or 3 places in the cylinder at slightly different times, which causes the otherwise um, uh, very smooth firing of the cam-driven valves to it doesn't make sense. If the thing is still combusting when the valve opens, you will hear it resonate throughout the vehicle, as opposed to just being confined to the cylinder of the engine. So uniform combustion is an obsession of the fuel industry and the automotive industry, and as a result, all sorts of additives and other things have to be were thought of. And indeed, biofuels, as I understand it, biofuels. Less people think that this was only an invention of Vinod Khosla in Silicon Valley 15 or 20 years ago. The thought of growing corn for ethanol and or diesel fuel. This was, in fact, very early on known that you could, the moment they figured out what the combustion requirements were for automobiles, they experimented with bio oil or biofuels, and these will slightly smooth out the combustion. They were early on thought of as an additive to smooth out the combustion. It's never mind the mileage or the fact that you're getting a fuel from a crop instead of drilling it out of the earth. They weren't thinking of that. In fact, right from the start, they were concerned that growing corn for an additive for gasoline would be an unwise idea. But it wasn't just that. There were other chemicals and additives that smoothed out combustion and eliminated knocking much better than biofuels. So here is a chart of the relative anti-knock effectiveness of various compounds. And you can see that ethanol, down there at the lower right, which is one of the things you could get from a biofuel, has only a tenth of a percentage, I guess, effectiveness. But you've got all of these things: dimethyl cadmium, methylalanine, tetraethylitin, stannic chloride. All of these are additives that they decided that they tried adding until they came up with tetraethyl lead. And so many of you who are the age of the generation of myself and Guy might wonder, why was it that gasoline had lead in it? And that they had to, over time, and with great resistance from both the automotive industry and the fuel industry, the oil industry, to get rid of the lead additive in fuels. And indeed, there were countries in Africa and Asia that only in the last 5 years got rid of all the lead in their fuels. Lead has been allowed in agricultural fuels for a long time. It may still be that you get leaded gasoline in if you have a certain farm implements, but I think it's actually been eliminated. Tetraethyl lead had a powerful ability to prevent knocking and to preserve the engine life of engines. And so that's why lead was added. People have made the point that violent crime seemed to surge right from when tetraethyl lead began to be added in the late 30s, early 40s, and then seems to have gone down just as we began banning lead in gasoline. So is there a relationship? We don't know, but lead is not good for mental clarity or healthy immune system or anything else. So this is just interesting. It just goes to show that even once we had gasoline, anything we needed to do to make it burn more thoroughly, burn better, go faster, create more even power curve for a combustion engine, we did, even if it was poison. The octane ratings that we see, again, the early octane, I think the early octane ratings of gasoline was about 40, and now it's up in the 80s or low 90s. And it apparently it doesn't necessarily mean that it's much more powerful. It's all about making the combustion more complete, which is better environmentally. It's only slightly better environmentally than poor combustion. The emissions that result from inefficient combustion are worse than the emissions that result from efficient combustion. But everything has a cost. Nothing is free. Thermodynamics cannot be violated. It takes more fuels have to be processed to a greater degree with more heat to create 93 octane than 87 octane. So you pay the piper one way or another.
Well, yes. I mean, most people are going to select the least efficient route because it's less expensive, right?
Right.
And most people don't understand the costs, the consequences of choosing. I suspect that will continue because we're all about the bottom line. We're all about the money, at least in this country, and as nearly as I can tell, throughout the so-called first world.
It's fully 80 cents more per gallon.
That's huge.
Mm.
You know, you're putting 20 gallons in at a time.
This is just a more detailed diagram to show all of the things we get from each fraction. So starting at the bottom, and I'm sorry that it's so small, but at the bottom is a giant container ship and asphalt highways. So what we get out of a barrel of oil at the bottom is some amount of bunker oil that goes into shipping, and we'll talk about that a little further, and asphalt. And above that, we get, I think this is the diesel. And then above that is aviation fuel. And then in the middle fraction, it's the components that give us plastics, textiles, nylon. Keep in mind, almost every synthetic fabric is actually from oil. Pharmaceuticals. Many drugs begin as a molecule extracted from or organic molecules. We are organic beings, and organic chemistry is the branch of chemistry that basically can be summed up as carbon chemistry, or the chemistry of life. And numerous other chemicals, pesticides, much of the ag chemicals, pharma, big pharma, and pesticides are begin as molecules from gasoline. It's not as simple as that it's just spraying naphtha on things. No, these chemicals have to be refined into super toxic neurotoxins that go supposedly only after certain types of insects, but don't harm your children. Or they go after certain weeds but don't harm, the residues of them aren't harmful to us if we eat them. Ha ha. I'll tell you another one. And then up here is gasoline for cars. I think cars are represented at two levels because you have diesel cars and diesel vehicles and gasoline vehicles. And then at the top is the lightest of the fractions, which are, again, liquefied propane gas and other much lighter fuels that usually come out in liquid or gas form. And here's another visual summary. Again, you can't some people really like having a visual representation. Kerosene and jet fuel, lubricants and waxes, diesel for trucks, bunker oil for ships, asphalt, LNG. So we are engaged in our society of a vigorous effort to take one of these products, that would be gasoline, which is about 20% of a barrel of oil. Again, it totally depends on what oil you're getting from where, how much diesel, how much of each of these fractions will come from Texas crude oil versus Dubai or Saudi crude from different parts of the field. It might vary from 20% gasoline to 40% gasoline. Diesel is usually between 10 and 13% of a barrel. So you get about half as much diesel as you do gasoline from a barrel of oil. And again, this matters. We've seen that diesel has become more expensive. And so diesel used to be cheaper during the oil glut. Um, but we're engaged in our society in a belief that, and an effort, and big money is being spent, big hopes are being pinned on changing gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. But there's at least 8 other major uses of fossil fuels that will necessitate us to keep digging them out, unless someone fantasizes that we're going to have very quickly electric planes, electric ships, um, and all electric trucks. There are people who believe this, that it's just around the corner, wholesale conversion. But I mean, let's make as much progress as we can, but we're not there yet. Go ahead.
If you've been paying attention, you've been hearing a lot about bunker oil lately as the fuel that allows ships to go back and forth in the Atlantic Ocean. And the new rules involving cleaner bunker fuel have led to loss of aerosol masking in that region and a heating up quite suddenly of the area in and around the Atlantic Ocean.
That is quite right. The laws went into effect. Bunker oil is very high sulfur, very dirty oil, and the laws went into effect. The whole industry was warned about these laws. They had many years to prepare. That they must put scrubbers, either use a higher class of oil or put scrubbers on shipping, if shipping is to go into certain parts, mainly the developed world. If shipping is only, I think that if the shipping is just going from one dirty third world country to another, that they may still be able to use. So I think it is geography dependent, but it has had the effect that a very significant proportion of the bunker oil being used at sea. Oh, and the other thing is, it was for decades, the environmentalists didn't focus on this because it was deemed like, how bad can it be if bunker oil, since a ship spends most of its time in the open ocean, it's not polluting. From the word pollute, from a pollution perspective, it's very dirty oil, of dirty smoke that it creates. And who cares if it's out over the open ocean? People weren't able to see it or smell it or focus on it most of the time. So the laws that came into effect just since 2020 have so reduced the amount of sulfur. Am I right, Guy? It is the additives, not the additives, but the residues of contaminants like sulfur and stuff that are in the oil anyway. They're in the heavier grades of oil, and scrubbing those out reduces the particulates and thus the aerosol masking. Is that do I have
Yes,
that right?
yes, that's right. It's sulfur, usually expressed as sulfates in the atmosphere. Yes.
Right. And the result of reducing the sulfates, and we're going to go deeper into this, but just to articulate it again, our activities in releasing greenhouse gases cause heating, but our activities that include, in this case, releasing aerosols, particulate matters, and certain types of particulates have a cooling effect. And it could be that the scientific focus has only been on greenhouse gases, and very few scientists have been willing to admit or acknowledge or try and figure out how much cooling has been being done all along by the particulates that we've been releasing, such that if we suddenly start cleaning up those particulates, we're doing less of the cooling while continuing to do all of the heating. With what result, Guy?
Right. And the first peer-reviewed paper I found on the subject goes back to 1929, and a paper by Hansen and colleagues in 2012, I believe it is, found essentially identical masking between 1929 and 2012. The industrial activity taking place through that time obviously increased from 1912 to essentially the current day, has profoundly increased, but the aerosol masking effect was essentially the same. That's interesting, and I haven't seen much research on what has happened after that and what kind of masking is provided today compared to 10 or 50 or 100 years ago.
Indeed. And in a future episode, we're going to go deep with Guy McPherson into aerosol masking. We will trace over all that history. We will even hopefully be able to see that such people as Bill Mollison, the co-founder of permaculture with David Holmgren, uh, was very familiar with aerosol masking and knew that if we quote unquote cleaned up our pollution, that it might actually accelerate heating. And so there is a subcurrent of savvy people and people willing to admit that this has to be thought through, who've been willing to admit it, but very few. Am I right, Guy?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, you'll have a very difficult time finding a paid climate scientist, a media personality, or a government official even talking about aerosol masking, much less its astonishing consequences. Astonishing just because nobody ever talks about it. So most of us don't know a thing about it.
I'm going to digress here a minute because I wonder if part of it is the kind of unfortunate thing we see from some scientists, whereas something is a counter trend or seems like it's a counter trend to what they are trying to communicate. And instead of being willing and as a good teacher, willing to communicate and try and instruct what this nuance is, they choose not to because they make an assumption that people won't understand it and they will get the wrong conclusion. What are your thoughts on that?
There's no doubt in my mind. Absolutely. We're told from birth that we must conserve fossil fuels. And so then you tell somebody that in conserving fossil fuels, we're going to lose aerosol masking, and that's going to lead to the ability to superheat the planet, as has been demonstrated throughout COVID-19, and more recently in the Atlantic Ocean with these studies that take a look at cleaner
Right.
fossil
I
fuels.
mean, right. Already, just what you're saying will make many people's head explode. I mean, but why have they not just tried to explain that our human activities do have such an effect, and that we don't just do one thing? We're doing so many things. When we dig up and burn these ancient forms of carbon, these oils, coals, and gases, we're not just doing one thing. We're not just releasing multiple classes of greenhouse gases, each of which contributes to heating. But our activities are also releasing particulates, which contribute to cooling. And it's important that we understand that, because if we clean up one without the other, well, we're going to see symptoms of a greater effect. And rather than communicate that, they seem to be thinking that if they communicate that anything we do is cooling, then we're going to question. I mean, I think their heads just can't get around that science is actually nuanced. Uh, things, things are a system. Systems have multiple effects. Systems oscillate between certain um, effects, and they just can't explain it. They refuse because they don't think we're up for it. And maybe they're right, but I don't know. It's
Yeah,
not telling the truth.
no, I agree. Absolutely. We have been telling people for their entire lives, if you're as old as us or younger, that we must conserve fossil fuels. That's the whole message. And I'm convinced that government personalities and media people, I'm convinced that those people think that we're just not smart enough, that we can't handle two conflicting messages at the same time. Even though people do that very frequently on other topics, but this one just seems
Well,
too challenging to
well,
share message.
it reminds me to, and I'll digress a little further. It reminds me of how the scientists and the governments handled the facts about this recent pandemic, because I'll just give several examples. Rather than make the detailed explanation that initially, if you remember, we were told for the first month, don't try and wear a mask. Masks will result in greater infection. Masks will, by touching the mask, you'll infect yourself. Masks don't really do anything. Then they did a full reverse on that and said, you must wear masks. But if you have a good mask, take it to a hospital or a firefighter, because the good masks, these N94s or whatever they were, they're in short supply. So they then changed and told us this. Now, then they said the masks will prevent you getting COVID. Well, so this was a lie as well. This is not true. They will reduce your risk of transmitting it if you have it and you don't know it, or you do know it. They won't completely eliminate your risk, but they will reduce it slightly. This is why doctors and nurses wear masks even before COVID, to reduce actually spitting into your wound the E. coli that is in their mouth. So there's that. They lied about that. And then at every stage, they then said, you got to get vaccinated. And they didn't actually say the nuance that if you've already had COVID and you have a doctor or a nurse to write a note that you have recovered from COVID, any virologist would reasonably think that that is almost as good as having been vaccinated. And I think most people knew that, and it was intolerable that people who had recovered from COVID weren't given the same privileges as this is if a doctor would write you a note and you've been tested that you had to go get they imposed this thing, and many restaurants and places closed off if you weren't vaccinated. Everything was a lie. And then they said the vaccination will prevent infection with COVID. That was never going to be true. They knew right from the start that vaccination is only 60% effective, like the flu. But instead of telling us that, they didn't explain the vaccination will reduce your risk of a severe infection. It won't completely eliminate any risk. It just will make it less likely that you'll be hospitalized. If you're hospitalized, make you less likely that you will end up on a ventilator. And if you end up on a ventilator, less likely that you will die on that ventilator. They couldn't explain that it's just somewhat helpful. So everyone formed conspiratorial opinions about it. And I think the same is going to happen, or is happening with this climate stuff. They're not telling us the whole truth.
And I think this goes back to Edward Bernays, who convinced people to focus in advertising and corporatocracy in general, to focus on a single simple message. And if you deviate from that single simple message, then it's going to confuse people. And they're going to think that you're saying that we should burn all the fossil fuels we can because that produces aerosol masking. And so, right?
Yeah.
I really think the people in government, the people who are, quote, running the show, think that we're stupid and we can't handle conflicting messages.
And to a certain extent, the media, the behavior of the media confirms what Bernays said, and what Bernays and the strategies of what's called public relations and marketing are very effective for a lot of people. But it's still, I think, sad that scientists try and give into that or end up giving into it and not communicating the true nuances of things, because if they were to at least communicate all the nuances as well as they could, that's consistent with trying to get at and communicate the truth. Whereas trying to simplify it or ignore something just because it's hard to communicate, that's not truthful.
Yeah, and this is something that Carl Sagan told us many times, is that it's difficult to convey complicated messages. It's easy to convey simple messages. And even if the simple messages are inaccurate or incomplete, people are going to understand them better than they do the complex messages. Even when it's really not that complex. It's only two factors we're talking about here, and most people can handle two things at a time.
Mm.
I mean, I used to use this as an example in my classes. I would juggle one ball, and then I would juggle two balls. And then I would point out how much more difficult it is to keep three balls in the air at the same time, as
Right.
opposed to two. It's an exponential increase in difficulty. And and I think that so many people out there in leadership positions think that we can only handle one ball at a time.
That's
So so they're sticking to that.
oh yeah, this is just another thing. And again, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is just like on average, you're going to get 20 gallons of gasoline, 12 gallons of diesel, 3.5 gallons of jet fuel, and other products from a barrel. Now, of course, this can vary, and this is why being, the U.S. as an energy, as an oil exporter, is only partially true. There are at any given time, if it's cheaper to get diesel, if diesel is in short supply and the price of diesel is going up, you could find oil that is very suited to diesel fractioning being imported into this country or any country. For us as people to truly try and understand this industry and its commercial behavior, you have to realize that if refined diesel is more expensive in the US right now than refined diesel imported from somewhere, you might actually find us importing diesel. It doesn't mean that we're not self-sufficient in oil overall. It just means that a particular fraction of oil is cheaper right now coming from Venezuela or something than it is trying to dig more of it out of Texas. But we're probably selling some other fraction that is to some other entity. It's all now very sophisticated, very much more sophisticated than it was just 30 years ago or 60 years ago. The trading and the economics of oil and gas.
Yes, absolutely. And so what works to inexpensively create gasoline from one oil, say in Venezuela, is a completely different story than what contributes to making gasoline in the tar sands, for example, of Alberta, Canada.
Indeed. And you find such things as, you know, Scandinavian countries have reduced their emissions by refining their oil and sending the dirtier products. They only keep the cleanest burning gasoline and diesel for themselves, and they sell the dirtiest oil. Guess where? To Africa. And so, it just is a lot of what's happening in the world is shifting emissions, and we can talk about that. We've been shifting coal emissions. We've reduced our coal consumption and use in North America hugely, but the products that we're buying, most of the steel, aluminum, other things that we are now using is made in China or Ukraine or other countries where they use coal every morning for breakfast. They use coal, and they use coal to make steel and to uh, power their electric grid so that all their factories can make the crappy products that we buy for a discount at Target and Walmart. So, have we really reduced coal in North America? Yes, we've shifted it to the products we buy from China. And China's use of coal has gone through the roof and is still going through the roof and probably will for the next 10, 20, 30 years. They are trying, but their coal use has basically replaced coal use in the U.S. and Europe. But we can't feel like our consumption. I mean, some people will look at you smugly and say, "Oh, so we're not using coal anymore in North America," and I just feel that's a little dishonest. What do you think, Guy?
Oh, absolutely. It's one world, folks, and there's more than 8 billion people in it, on the planet. And you can't tell me that you can save the world until you can convince more than 8 billion people that we all have to head in the same direction, that
Right.
we are all actually one. And I haven't seen a lot of progress on that front.
So again, this is just to show that I'm not making it up. That Boston, Maya, Arabian Light, West Texas Intermediate, Bass Strait, you can see how different the fractions that come from each of these are. And so you can see quite clearly that if you want middle distillates, you would start from West Texas Intermediate or Bass Strait. If you want naphtha or kerosene, you wouldn't start with Boskin. Maybe if you want fuel oil for ships, you would start with Boskin. I don't know where that's from, but they're very, very different. And we're not even talking about the things that come from fracking or from oil sands, which would be, again, require a lot more processing to get these fractions out of. And so oil exploration, we saw that Edwin Drake simply used a crude drill to go down a dozen feet in Pennsylvania. Today, the geologists and oil companies have at their disposal a absolutely dizzying array of high-tech, increasingly, this is literally like doing a CAT scan or an MRI scan of the planet itself. They have such sophisticated devices that can create almost a picture of the layers beneath. Shown here is satellites, airplanes that have ground penetrating radar of various kinds. The ship is dragging a bunch of buoys behind it that are sending down a series of waves to track some sort of differential frequencies under the earth. And so represented in the upper left is a traditional geologist with her hammer simply chipping away experimentally. Surely some of that is going on as well, but with a absolutely dizzying array of high-tech equipment to try and detect where the next type of petroleum that we're going to dig out and burn is going to be found. And increasingly, even smaller quantities or fractions of it are to be found that would not have been exploited or exploitable before, but now can be at greater cost. Thoughts, Guy?
And there's the issue right there, at greater cost.
Yeah, and the price is going up. I mean, the price is now steadily at over $70 a barrel. So many of the kinds of exploration that's depicted here will result in fines, which they just pencil out as consumable, exploitable reserves. And it's very interesting to note that if the price of oil goes up because of a shortage created, say, by a war in Ukraine or the Middle East, the immediate effect of that price going up is people think, oh, oil and gas is now more expensive, boo-hoo, and they start whining at their governments. And believe me, even the environmentalists start whining. And the governments that do not respond by unleashing the oil and gas companies to go find more stuff, those governments don't last long because the population wants this stuff. But that aside, the immediate effect, if you think about oil price, is that if now it's $90 a barrel, all of a sudden, half of the oil and gas that's just pictured on this slide, that in this just schematic image, there is oil and gas which would be completely ignored as completely worthless and unexploitable at $60 a barrel. But if the price is up at 90, on the one hand, half the population is screaming, crying that the price of getting to work is greater, the price of shipping, the price of their cheeseburger is greater. But the oil companies are laughing their way to the bank because all of a sudden their reserves go up by 30%. And you might ask, how can the stated reserves of oil companies go up suddenly? They go up the moment the price goes from $70 to $90 a barrel for any length of time. They are legally allowed to state that they now have exploitable reserves much greater than they did just 2 quarters ago. And they're not lying. They're not inventing it. And they didn't actually, in most cases, I think you can see, they don't actually have to spend a dime. They have known about these reserves and they're on their books as not exploitable below $90 a barrel. Now that oil is at $90 a barrel, they suddenly switch. They're on their books. They switch from a liability, not even an asset or liability. It's just an unexploitable reserve to a legitimate reserve. And so if you start to understand just how kooky the oil and gas industry is and how it works, you can then understand how can it be that reserves have expanded so suddenly when the price has gone up to $90 a barrel. It's one of several ways in which reserves, the statement of reserves, can be misleading, or can surprise you, right? Guy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's almost as if it's all about the money.
It is 174% all about the money. And that's all it's about. And the oil companies are not doing anything illegal in this regard when they suddenly say, Exxon suddenly says, well, price goes from $60 a barrel to 90 and stays there for 2 quarters. Exxon is within its right, in fact, is legally obligated to be honest and say that it now has, 40 billion cubic meters more exploitable gas and oil than it did just 3 quarters ago. And it hasn't had to send a single ship or geologist out. Geologists are sitting there with their feet up. It's just because of the price of oil that they now have much more exploitable resources. And they haven't had to dig them out yet either. They may or may not even dig them out. It all depends on if the price stays up there for long enough, and they will always be asking for sweeteners. They will ask the UK government, US government, whatever government they need to ask. They'll say, well, you say you're upset. Your people are whining at you that gasoline is now $4.75 a gallon. We might be able to get it down to $4 or $3.75 a gallon. What if you give us these offshore leases and the exploration rights now for all this gas we think is under this mantle, this part of the country? You want to do that for us? And, give us the rights to do that. And, oh, by the way, indemnify us from environmental damage. And they extract these kinds of commitments from governments all the time. It's just business.
Of course, because nothing is more important to the people of this country, the vast majority of people in this country, than the price of whatever. And the price of fuel, gas, diesel, whatever, is fundamental in a country that is built completely on suburbia, completely on, right? I mean, that's how we built this country after World War II. We created the interstate highway system and we put in suburbs. So now you have to walk. I mean, you have to drive to work, you have to drive to the grocery store, you have to drive everywhere to get anything done.
We put everything apart. We created what is urban planners who are smart call the iron triangle, which is your work is 20 miles from your home, the children's school is 8 miles from their home, and where the wife or the husband, whoever it is that is saddled with staying at home, if they have that kind of family structure, why that person then has to drive 8 miles to the shopping center. All of these things are in different directions, and the premise is that you have a car. The premise of the suburbs was that you have a car in which gasoline costs 27 cents a gallon, and I suppose it was sustainable when that was true, but that didn't stay true for very long, did it?
No, those days are behind us, folks. Like 27-cent gasoline.
It's
Wow.
funny because I marvel that one of the TV series that was made during this 1950s expansion on television was Blondie. And if people remember, what was the Dagwood Bumpstead? What did he do every morning? He was given his urgent cup of coffee and black coffee that looked like tar. It looked like bitumen. And then his toast, which was burned black, which he preferred, and started crunching away at it as he grabbed his briefcase and his coat from his wife to go out to his carpool. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in the 50s, many families didn't have a car. if they had car, they only had one, and they didn't want to leave their wife. It was their wife in the 50s. Um, you can send the hate mail for me saying that to someone else. It was likely the wife, and the husband was running out to a carpool because they were pooling their cars so that the husband and his three or four fellows could get to the city and leave at least a few of the wives with a car so they could ferry the brat children around and go to the fucking grocery store to prepare their husband a dinner and meet him with the food ready. Um, Carpools were necessary because people couldn't afford two cars back then. And it was actually fairly efficient compared to today, where everyone has, I mean, lots of people in the suburb have multiple cars. It's not acceptable not to have a car per person. And that if you leave a spouse at home with the brat children, there has to be a town car, what is it? The town and country SUV has to be left for the wife, and the husband is taking the sports car, or the partner who works, excuse me, who has to go work in the commute, if that still happens, is taking the other car, and is not carpooling generally. So things actually in the 50s, there was, if you look beneath the layers, there were certain things we were doing there that looked like energy conservation compared to today's behavior. Guy, am I crazy for seeing that?
No, not at all. For the first time well, since January of 1983, there is one car in this two-person household. One of the people works all day, every day. And so what that means is when I need to go anywhere, I ride a bicycle or I walk.
Well, that's very efficient, and kudos to you for saving the planet, Guy,
I
on a
can't,
daily
you
basis.
you can't even imagine what a pain in the butt this is. If you
Yes,
haven't
sir.
been in this situation, it's a long way to the grocery store from here.
It is. It is. And there used to be in your town, I'm sure there used to be many more small merchants and grocers scattered around that one could walk to. But now you probably, to get stuff, have to go to one shopping center that it requires a vehicle or a cargo bicycle to pedal there
Absolutely.
laborious.
Absolutely. It's in fact it's a state away. I have to go to New Hampshire to get to a real grocery store.
Yep. We haven't exactly built things for convenience. And um, there used to be railroads and tram lines in many small towns that now have no public transit whatsoever. And you could operate in 1910, 1920, you could operate in many of these towns without a car much more conveniently than you can today. Um, and you wouldn't be putting as much sweat on your brow either. So with all of this exploration, the oil, to get it to your, there's a much more professionalized and complex system of distribution. The oil is taken from domestic crude, imported crude, to refineries. It's put into storage at the refineries. Pipelines go to terminals. It's then dispatched by tanker trucks to your local gas station and magically comes out when you put your credit card or pay cash to the guy in the little bulletproof kiosk. He will allow you to turn on the tap and turn on this magic fluid that just got there seemingly very naturally. But behind it is all of this very highly schematized network that's
And
now much more orderly, seemingly, and invisible to us than it was in the hills of Pennsylvania.
right, and look at all the fossil fuels underlying your ability to go to the gas station and fill up. I
Sure.
mean,
How is that tanker truck powered these days? Is it powered by solar panels on its roof?
how about the domestic crude oil from the pump jack? Do you think
Right.
that had a solar panel running it? No, of course not.
And we are going to great lengths. I mean, not just offshore, but offshore in Arctic and Antarctic waters now, where it doesn't matter if ice flows come by. And you'll notice the flames here. This is a this the flames on this offshore oil rig aren't there because someone has left the stove on and the place is burning down. No, that it is flaring just the massive amounts of methane. This is obviously not a gas rig. This is a oil rig or whatever. They have so much methane is released. And we haven't talked about the emissions of digging this stuff up. When you change land in any way, when you plow a field to plant a crop, you release greenhouse gases. Am I correct, Guy?
Yes, absolutely. I did my graduate work in Texas, and you would see gas being flared off of all these wells every time I went to the field to conduct field research. Every
And
time
that's
you
just what they're Am I
drive by.
right? That's just what they're flaring. There's unflared emissions that you don't see. It's invisible. You're not going to tell, and it's on a scale far greater than the emissions that they're able to ignite and flare. Is the emissions that come out of all human uses of the land, but particularly the mining of anything, the drilling of for oil or gas results in so much gas emissions of methane and other greenhouse gases from the process.
It's astonishing. And yet again, something over which the masses have no control. Most people don't even know. And that is fundamental to maintaining this set of living arrangements,
But
right?
but Guy, you can compensate for all of this by taking your perfectly good natural gas stove and unhooking it and putting it on the side of the road and going and buying a $1,200 induction stove and switching it to and calling an electrician to switch that out and then buy some new cookware and you've saved the planet.
Uh-huh. If only saving the planet were so simple.
Well, from some people who talk to me about it, that's all it takes. And the fact that I haven't done that yet means I must want the planet to burn up. So,
You got
but
to find
meanwhile, Exxon can have this oil rig. I don't get it.
you have to find more intelligent friends.
Okay, I will. I'll start looking now. So, and this just takes us through how has the land, what does it look like? This is an entire area that's just oil derricks. This is contemporary. This is not some previous era where they've cleaned it up. This is in the United States. It's in the West. Whole regions of the West have this. This is an example of fracking, which you might be looking at a farm field and it looks green, but somewhere there's an operation that's just started up because that entity owns the mineral rights underneath, and the farmer might be told, "Well, we're going to start an operation right here under your farm."
Yes, who owns the mineral rights is very often different from the person who owns the surface rights.
And the mineral rights could have been owned for 100 years by some set of entities and consortia that you don't even know the name of. You might go and find the original, and it's a company that doesn't even exist, but oh, it does because its assets were acquired by Company Q, which was acquired by Company M, which merged with Company S, and they're the ones who have hired some. It won't even be that company. They will have hired some fracking crew to turn up. A certified letter probably would have been sent the week before, and they'll turn up and say, "We're starting our operation now."
Get your buildings and cars out of our way.
That's it. Or we're taking over this part of your field. And if you will read the fine print, we have a right to create whatever operations we need on the surface to exploit our mineral.
Isn't that beautiful?
It is. It's a thing of beauty. This is a vast region, I think, of the U.S. And it's an oil field.
It looks like the Midland Odessa region
I think it may be. Yeah.
of Western Texas.
Yeah. I've flown over it and seen it from a plane, and it's astonishing. You wonder what are all of those. This is probably Corpus Christi, so you can see those towers in which all the fractions of oil and fuels and things that we need from a barrel of oil are being obtained. Massive amounts of energy have to be burned to do the refining.
Look at how much prettier it is at night than it is during the day.
Well, I also just marvel that the coastal city of Texas that is named the body of Christ, Corpus Christi, is one of the filthiest, most contaminated, most oil and gas stricken parts of our entire nation, the
Yeah,
body of Christ.
I wouldn't recommend swimming into the ocean from that particular beach.
And right near it is the beautiful, I think, what's called South Padre Island National Seashore, is just a few miles from it. And how those two things are in the same place is always a marvel to me. Or it looks like this massive tankers of what is being stored, um, whether it's the crude oil or the distilled product being stored from it or gas. It's very sophisticated tankers, a little more sophisticated than the barrels back there in Titusville. And so we come to the end here for today. Climate change, apparently, Guy, we are believing that there's less polar ice every year, less thick ice, less total ice coverage. By every measure, less ice. The ice is doing a poorer job of cooling. We're finding out so much more about it. Um, what do you think the reaction of the oil and gas companies is to the knowledge that the polar ice is disappearing?
Well, they're certainly going to have to change their marketing strategy, aren't they?
I think they are. Drill, baby, drill. That is what they see. When they see that the climate is warming and that particularly the Arctic, is now navigable much of the year, and that land sources and shallows are now navigable, they see one thing, and it's not just our geology, not our oil companies, the Russians, the Scandinavians, the Canadians, they see one thing up here: drill, baby, drill. Now, more exploitable reserves. And the price at which Arctic exploration and the oil and gas that it will undoubtedly yield, we just have to wait. The oil companies and gas companies, we just have to wait till what? Let's see, $100 a barrel, $110 a barrel for a sustained period. It will be worthwhile to go after that stuff. And there is a shit ton of it up there. And don't even get me started on Antarctica.
You can almost smell the money from the corporate warehouse in Houston, Texas.
And believe me, they are going to go after it. They are already planning it. Our last slide, as usual, in this series, till further notice, the human mastery of fossil hydrocarbons for the industrial age, coal, oil, and natural gas. We are just about here. Who knows what's on the other side of the downslope? Whether this is a downslope that nature forces us on by the hydrocarbons becoming too expensive to exploit, and have any kind of a functioning economy, whether they actually are so limited that we start running out of them. Again, we could run out of them because they're unavailable, unexploitable, or too expensive, or because they can't be found. I think the last one is the least likely. I think they will become unexploitable for other reasons, or beyond. They will just wreck economies. But we may also be seeing that we're being compelled to get rid of them, which I guess is a good thing, and embrace other ways of running industrial civilization, of trying to have the same set of living arrangements, as you call it, Guy, while using something different that has a lower quote unquote carbon footprint, will seemingly result in less emissions, thus curing the problem that we have caused. Either of those two can't happen fast enough, one way or another. But we will be exploring these in future sessions.
Yes, you and I, Neil, were fortunate to select the time and place of our birth. With when and where things turn south in the near future, in the distant future, remains to be seen. But we've had an amazing run for the
We
first
have.
64 years.
And by the time I was conscious enough about this, I was in my late teens or early 20s, and I was very interested in conservation um, and energy conservation as well as ecosystem conservation. And I was trying to learn about it. And then this man was elected president, named Ronald Reagan, who basically told the country, rip off whatever solar panels we're using. Let's rip those off and let's drill, baby, drill. And pollution laws and environmental laws are regulation that it hampers our freedoms and violates shareholder value. And this friend of mine, the economist Milton Friedman, says that no company should do anything. No company has any other duty to its shareholders other than to maximize shareholder value by exploiting the market for their product as much as they can. And, most people I went to college with nodded north, south and said, yup, that sounds right. Yeah, well, how could you oppose that? And that was 1980. It's amazing to think of the year of this movie. The movie Wall Street is made in 1986, in which Michael Douglas plays a stock private equity corrupt investor who exploits a young, willing intern who Charlie Sheen, played by Charlie Sheen, whose father is an aviation union man who works in, I think, the baggage handling at an airport and is a union man, does an honest day's work. And the Charlie Sheen character is induced to perform illegal insider trading and corrupt stock manipulation activities by the Michael Douglas character, Gordon Gekko, a lizard name, interestingly, who delivers a speech in that movie on greed, saying greed is good. And the astonishing thing about that movie, Guy, is that, first of all, it comes along in 86, which means it had to be conceived in 85. I mean, to be written, it had to be thought through as a plot. And it is, I have literally have people, and the reviewers began quoting that movie and those lines that Gordon Gekko said as a good thing, as a wise thing, as a role model. In other words, the role model to take from that movie, if you have a soul, is the father, the union man who's trying to raise his son properly. But Guy, what do most people you meet who've seen that movie, who are they envious of and who do they take as the role model?
It's always the same. Greed is good,
Gordon Gekko.
right? I mean, that line is the signature line for the entire film. It says it all. Greed is good.
He's the hero of that movie, and although he is, I don't actually think his arrest is portrayed at the end. Only Charlie Sheen is arrested, and I'm sure in the real world, Charlie Sheen would have gone to jail. They would have thrown away the key, and Gordon Gekko would be out in 2 years from a minimum security prison. But they actually didn't prosecute anybody for what happened in 2008, the financial crisis. They prosecuted.
Right.
I think they prosecuted 2 people, both of them brown people. An Indian trader on Wall Street was prosecuted for insider trading. He did nothing. I mean, it was small potatoes. But yeah, how much could we have? What could we have done differently since 1980, as from our young adulthood onwards?
Well, let's start with, I don't know, everything. Everything comes to mind.
I don't know, Guy. You've invented. You have at least another book called real estate strategies for the Anthropocene.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's just what I need to do.
You got to write that.
Okay.
Anyway, we should call it for today. But this has
We'll
been fun
we'll keep the audience informed about when that book.
when that book is out. All right. Take
Thanks,
care,
Bill.
and we will continue the story of Hydrocarbon Man.
Yes, we will. Stay tuned until next week, folks.